My assumption is that you can see the screen and it should talk about collections, working with lists. Am I right?
Yep.
Yes.
Solid.
Yes.
All right. We've got 40 minutes, 38 minutes to be exact, to jam through a concept called lists. I am not, I'm going to make it as easy as possible. I know it's a bit of an esoteric concept, um, but at the end of the day, what you should know is that any collection in our array or list or set in programming languages is multiple values assigned to one variable. Spoiler alert, that's pretty much what it is. And that's exactly what a list is. There are multiple types of collections in Python, but we are going to look at the case uses for the first one, which I think will probably be the most useful to you immediately, which is the list. So, our agenda for tonight: what is a list, how we access elements in a list, how we use the values that we've saved in a list. We're going to talk about adding, removing, and modifying lists and organizing lists. I will say this, brings up a great point. Um, you should have your interpreter up and ready to rock because there's a lot of code kicking that we're going to do here. Also, I'm going to share my screen, and just because we're talking about lists, I'm going to be using, I'm going to be using my IDE. I use Visual Studio Code for a lot of what I do. It's going to look a little different to a lot of people. Um, it's colorized. It's got a lot of stuff going on there. Don't let it distract you. I'm only using it because when using lists, it lets me visualize it um, in a different format than the interpreter normally does, and I want it to be as clear as mud, as close as I can for you guys. Um, don't get distracted by all the bells and whistles. Also, this probably indicates a good milestone, a good checkpoint. We are we are going to, in the next week, be moving from our standard interpreter, which is line by line, into doing something with a little more jazz. So we might be wanting to select an IDE. PyCharm is probably the most readily used by the new Python programmers. My personal preference is Visual Studio Code. Um, Almost any one that you can think of, I've used. If you have one that you want to use and you need help setting it up, let me know. But I will be putting my video on how to set up Visual Studio Code out there for everybody. Any questions on the IDEs or integrated development environments? You're going to see it in a second. Don't let it scare you. It's just another way of doing it. And then once you get into doing a little more complex things, it makes things easier. Slight learning curve, but definitely easier. All right, are we ready to kick it off? All right, hope my caffeine is kicking in. I think so. Cool. All right, so what's a list? Well, we've already talked about this. It's a collection is the overarching umbrella for several values under one variable. A list is a particular type of collection and it has the items in a particular order. That's it. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is a list. There are, of course, some rules and syntax, and the great thing, like I said about Python, is once you learn a fundamental level of something, you pretty much nailed it. So the rules and the syntax for lists are exactly the same as the rules and the syntax for variables, right? So we can't name a list starting with a number. We have to use the alpha numeric like index. We can use underscores for lists. Uh, that's that's pretty much the rundown on the syntax. Does anybody need a quick primer other than what I said about how what the rules are for variables? No? Okay, cool. So just like variables, lists are declared with the equal sign, also known as the assignment operator. And the only other difference between how we declare a variable as opposed to a list is Python uses hinters to let itself and let you help you inform the interpreter of what a data type is. and it uses brackets. You'll see this a lot in a lot of programming languages. They call this bracket notation. So just like in a regular variable declaration, we have our variable name, we have our assignment operator, and then right before we get into it, we need to let the interpreter know, I'm going to give you a slew of things. It's just not one item. I need you to create a more complex compendium of values. So we do an open bracket. That's the one just to the right of the P key, and then we start our list. So the syntax inside the list is a little different, but it's pretty forgiving. For all of our strings, we're going to use quotes. Single quotes or double quotes will do. And then at the end of the first item, when we move on to the next item, we use a comma to denote that the next item is coming. You can use both strings, ints, floats, even other lists, even other more complex things like objects, but we won't talk about that right now. And this is pretty much the instantiation or the declaration of a list. I know it's new, but a lot of the components of declaring a list should look pretty familiar. The only thing that's really new to us is the brackets. Any questions on this so far, guys?
Was this in that worksheet that we were supposed to do?
No, I think we just used variables. Or sorry, simple primitives. I don't know if we put lists in the worksheet.
Okay.
You
I'm
might
curious.
go ahead. Sorry.
Um, you said that you could even use another list. How do you refer to the other list in the brackets? Will Python just pick up that? Let's say you have a list called list A, and then as part of new list, you want list A as part of that. Do you just write list A and Python will figure it out?
Christian, it's a fantastic question. It's almost like I got ESP.
Huh.
So, if you want to do what's called a list within a list, these are also known as nested lists, but more commonly as multi-dimensional arrays. All you do is, let's say you put your first item in here. We got item 1, or element 1, element 2, and when the next item begins and you want to put a list, then you're just using the exact same notation. You're just nesting it inside. Does that make sense? It's a little wonky. This one I'll admit, it takes some time to wrap your head around this guy. But I don't know if we're going to be doing multi-dimensional arrays anytime soon, but this is what it looks like. Basically just taking and making a list if we were to have a list by itself, and then we're making it an element. It's just gonna, if it's not the first item in the list, it'll be prefaced by a comma, you put the brackets in, and you list everything else out.
Okay.
Cool. But
Yeah. Okay.
go ahead. Let's hear your thoughts because I know this is fresh, it's new, it's definitely different.
So I'm trying to analyze. Let's say you've got on line 5, new list 3 is equal to, and then
Uh,
new list 1 and 2. So you don't have to rewrite everything. It just Python will just figure it out.
right. Okay. So I feel bad because this might be confusing. This first part, this right here, line 3 is a list, and then there's a list within a list. So that's a multi-dimensional array. What I meant to demonstrate here was that if you already have a list created, you can assign a list, a variable, and then make the values other lists. And if you were to print those out, it would show you the first list, which is the first element technically, and then a comma, and then the second list. This is super confused, and I totally recognize that. I just wanted to show you that it was doable. But we can do a demonstration. You want to see a demo real quick? Would that make it
I get it by looking at it. I don't
okay?
know if anybody else does.
All right, very cool.
And Justin, so list and arrays are basically two terms for the same thing?
Yes, if you're coming from, let's see, JavaScript, your your collection choices are pretty basic. You've got an array, and then you've got objects. Uh, Python does things a little bit differently. They take after some of the practices of C++, of Rust, some other languages, because there are lists, and we'll get into this later. I didn't want to pull this out now, but we can. Um, some lists are what are called immutable, so you create them and they're constant. You cannot change them. The only way to
Mhm.
change them is to just obliterate them, delete them. There are some lists that the indexes are named so that you can refer to them by the name of the index, and then this is a basic list where it's essentially just an ordered list, and that order is whatever order you put things in the list. So, in answer to your question, a list is a lot like an array. If you're looking at it from another language perspective, there are more than just this type of array when you're looking at Python collections. And we'll get into those. But the list I feel is the most basic. They also have one called a tuple, which we'll get into in coming weeks. They have sets. They have frozen sets. They have, geez, there's quite a number of different types of collections, but the list is the most basic. This is your entry level collection right here. Does that answer your question, Hoshan?
Yes, yes. Thank
Cool.
you.
Of course. There's a convention that I want to make you aware of. Initially, it won't really help you, but typically, and obviously I'm not following the convention here, if you have a list of like items, they're named as plural. So if you're looking at a list of heroes, it would be heroes. If you're looking at a list of different types of tools, the list would be called tools with an S. They're plural. And I'll show you at the end of this lecture why that convention is important. It's because of how we walk through lists or iterate through lists in Python. But I just wanted to make you aware of it. You're not getting tested on it. I just wanted to share a convention that you'll see out in the wild whenever or if ever you look at Python code later on. Don't worry about the list within the list thing. I just wanted to make you aware of it's out there. You'll see it. Cool. All right, so let's talk about accessing elements in a list. But first, what the hell is an element? All right, so here is a list. This right here is if I typed in heroes is equal to, and then exactly these items. By doing that, I've created a list called heroes. Each item within my list is affectionately known as an element in programming terms. Now, if you remember from last week when we were talking about strings and how strings can actually be seen as arrays or collections, we were able to look at individual letters or individual characters of the string. That syntax that we learned about last week, and this is another thing that makes Python beautiful, translates over to everything that's list worthy, right? So you saw last time when we were looking at an entire sentence and then we used bracket notation, although we didn't have the name for it because we weren't quite at that phase yet. If we looked at a string that we saved to a variable and then we put in brackets 0, that would be the first character of that sentence. Well, here we got the exact same thing. If we're looking at our list of heroes and we wanted to look at heroes and in bracket notation put the number 1, well, our elements start with 0, 1, 2. So it would return to us, or it would give us back Captain America, because Captain America is the second, I know it's confusing, but the second element in our list. 0 would be the first, that would be Iron Man.
I haven't looked at any of last week's notes,
Okay,
so because I wasn't here last week,
that's right.
but
That's right. Okay, well, Christian, you'll see that this is an extreme throwback to what we learned in strings last week. The bracket notation is the same. By putting a number in the bracket, it's telling us, look at this index. Index starts at 0, 1, 2, all the way down the line. If we're looking at index number 1, that's item number 2. And that's the same way that we can look at strings um, as an array. It's kind of mind-blowing. That one you might have to watch this video on. It gets a little bit deep.
I mean, I got it.
Okay.
As 0 is the first number actually,
All right.
and then 1 second.
Okay, excellent. So if you guys remember also from the way we were kind of messing around and showing the power of looking at strings as a collection, you saw that in Python we can do all kinds of crazy stuff. So if we use the parentheses, okay. So I'm going to create a list. Give me a variable name. Let's go for it. Let's do something small, something easy. Let's go foods. How about that? So I've created instantly the Python interpreter knows whatever's going on. I am creating a list. There's going to be multiple values associated to foods. So let's go. I'm going to go hot dog, burger, ice cream. Cool. And this is the reason why I'm using my IDE, because I want you to be able to see the list as I write it. You can see how it's kind of shown up here. So let's take a look at, if I were to go, I'm going to use the print function, and I'm going to print foods. If I print foods, this list, it's going to give me everything. It's going to give me the entirety of the list. Right? If I were to use bracket notation and I were to say foods, open bracket, 0, close bracket, it's going to give me the first element, right? If I were to do 2, it would give me the first, second, third, the last element, right? But if I were to do something like, when I use the bracket notation and I put the colon, 2 numbers and a colon in there, this is basically saying, give me the element that's in index number 1 and everything, that's what this parentheses, everything up until, but not including the third element. So 1, 3 is saying, let's count the indexes. Index 0, index 1. So it's saying, give me burger, and then give me until I hit number 3, but not number 3. So 0, 1, 1's in there, that's a burger. 2's in there, that's ice cream. 3, but don't give me 3, give me up until 3. So the return, the output, would be burger and ice cream. If I add a 4 here, that's going to give me up until, but not including, number 4. If you were to omit one of these numbers on either side of the colon, it's saying give me to the end or the beginning of the list. Does that make sense, that notation? We got into it a little bit last week.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, really quickly, for those that were here last week, do you remember? Oh, it's in there. Perfect. What would happen if I put a -1 in the brackets? Whenever you
Does that
throw
give
it.
you an error?
Nope. Nope, not quite. Although it seems like it should. Whenever you throw a negative number in the brackets, that's like saying, I want to start at the back of the list. So -1 would be Black Widow. -2 would be Captain America. -3 would be an Iron Man. So, just so you know, if you ever see it, a negative is saying, instead of starting at the front of the list, I want to start at the back of the list. Okay? So, we can all surmise the whole accessing of elements in a list as, we have these collections called lists. We know that we're dealing with a list when we see bracket notation. Each item within our list is called an element, and the number of the slot given to that item is called the index. We always start at index 1, 0, 1, 2, and so on. If you're asking for an element back, like hero at index number 1, you're saying to the interpreter that you want it to return an element or a value. That's basically what the jargon is. Give it back to me, return this to me. And then you can use parentheses within the brackets to filter if you want to do what's called a slice. If you want to say, I only want a particular set from within this list. We're going to be playing with lists a lot, and specifically with these little filters in here. So don't fret if you're feeling a little shaky on this. For those that missed out on last week, we talked about this concept of methods. Basically, tools are actions that can be performed on text, on strings. So any of the methods that we used on a string before, or if you have a method that's used on an int before, you can use when you're looking at elements of a list. Do you remember how we had a method called lower? It was taking all text within, let's go back over here. So let's say I have a string, and the string was, hi everyone. Let's do, it was a very emphatic hi everyone. And if I were to print a string, our response would be, hi everyone, loud and proud, right? But we have these methods, these actions, these little tools, you know, the Swiss pocket knife of the programming world, that we can change and manipulate things without having to actually change the value. So if we did what's known as the lower method, which is, you know, a method when you see one, a method or a function because it's got a parentheses at the end, and they're all pretty aptly named. If I were to take this string and say, I'm using the lower method on it, the lower method makes everything lowercase. I don't care what you give me, I'm going to give it back to you in lowercase. That's how the lower method works. Well, anything that you can do to a string by itself, if you have that string within a list, you can do the exact same thing. So here you see we've got Captain America, you know, proper name, capital C, capital A. But if I say, give me the second element, or index 1 of heroes, but with the lower method, the response is going to be Captain America, lower C, lower A. Anytime we use those tools, or can use those tools on a string, we can use them even if those strings are in a list. And when we go into numbers more, you'll see some of the number methods. We can use those methods on a list. You don't have to know about the methods. I'm not too caught up on you knowing all the millions of methods that are in Python. I just want you to know, understand the concept that just because this string is encapsulated, it's all huddled into a list, we can use all of the tools that we use normally, and you don't need to relearn anything else just to be able to employ them if something's in a list. If it were by itself, if it were just Captain America as a string, then you'd be able to use the lower method. If you want to go and print a specific element from a string and use that method, you totally can. Completely fair game, and you'll get out exactly what you expected. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you remember last week we talked about F strings? Basically being able to put placeholders in there. So let's go, let me bring out So we just created a variable. The variable name is name, and the value is Johnny. If you put an F in front of the parentheses, in front of the quotes, that's the new way. Remember I told you how shitty it used to be? The new way that you can bring a variable that you've already created into a string without having to do a whole bunch of crazy magic. So, for example, I've got this string and it says hi, and there's just a placeholder. That placeholder is linked to this variable. I just brought it down here. If I were to print it out, so we used f strings as placeholders for variables. We can, any variable that we've already declared, we can bring into a string, and that way our strings are dynamic, our content's dynamic. We can change things at the drop of a hat. Let's say Johnny no longer exists and now it's Jane. Well, so be it. Because we didn't hard code Johnny's name in here, we used this placeholder. Now it says hi Jane. Well, going back off of that mechanism, we can do the exact same thing with lists. Let's say we had a list of names. We could put names and then the index number in bracket notation, and it would pull specifically that name without having to hard code anything. And if we wanted to break this down, I know this is a lot of confusion going on right here, but we know all of this stuff if we took it step by step. This entire statement, which looks huge, completely confusing, and funky, well, we know what each one is. Let's go from left to right. So we know that when we're creating a name, and we have it next to an equal sign, that we're creating a variable. That's cool. And we know that it's a variable and it's going to be assigned a value because that's the assignment operator. Is this good so far, guys? Does this all look familiar? Like a regular variable?
Yep.
All right, cool. So if we were to leave out this f and we just had a string, then we would just be assigning a string to a variable. But we know when we have an f in front of quotes that we're going to be using a placeholder of some kind. And that placeholder is, in fact, another variable. So here's a variable here. These little curly braces, or the mustaches as I like to call them, that's just a placeholder. You can put any variable in there that you want to. We just happen to put a variable for a specific element in a list. So while this looks extremely scary, completely unwieldy, just crazy, if you look at it step by step, it's all stuff that we know. Like, oh, okay, I got a variable. I'm going to assign it a string. Wait, I'm going to assign it a string, and this little f denotes that it's going to be dynamic. That means I can change it out whenever I need to. All right, so here's my string. My favorite superhero is, curly braces. This is a placeholder. So if I want to change it, I totally can. It's completely dynamic. And that placeholder just happens to be what we already learned. It's a list, and it's element 0. So this would tell us my favorite superhero is... Who would our favorite superhero be?
Iron Man.
Iron Man.
Iron Man, exactly. And that's pretty much all this does. It's saying, I'm going to give a predetermined string of text, and then I get to choose who my favorite superhero is. And if I change my mind, all of a sudden I'm like, you know what? I like leather pants a lot better than I do an iron suit. All I got to do is change this to a 2. And that's Black Widow. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
I know I'm clobbering you over the head with a lot of stuff, but we're going to get into it. We're going to start using it more and more and more. I just want you to see it's not scary if you take it piece by piece.
How do you change it once you've input that line?
Oh, great question. So it's not so much that, let's go. You would change the value that's in here. So you would change from a 0 to a 1. This is, how do I describe this? This is more for not that you're changing the text itself, but you are doing something in your code that changes the heroes, or it changes the list, or changes the variable in some way. So this is going to be constant. You're going to do something in your code that changes the list. Does that make sense?
Kinda. I'm playing with my command line right now, trying to see it in practice.
Okay.
Can I assume also that, let's say the 0, that can be a variable name? So let's say we want to just input a choice from the user.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me demonstrate that real quick. What Christian is talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong here. Can I dynamically ask the user for input and that would be presented?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can reproduce really quick for you. What Christian is bringing up is there's a method called input, and that input takes information from the user. The way that you would invoke this in a way that's meaningful is like this. So let me run this for you. Can you guys see this small part right here? What I'm doing is I'm creating a variable called name. And then instead of assigning it a value, I'm assigning it this function called input, which is saying, as a user, give me something. Then the next line I'm saying print hi there, but it's an F string, which means it's dynamic, and that the mustaches or the curly braces say take whatever's in name and say hi there, whatever's in name. So if I run this, now that it's saved, if I put in Johnny, it now says hi there Johnny because it's taking the value of name, which is, it could be whatever I put in. So let's just say Carlos is my new name. Hi there Carlos. Is that what you were asking me a moment ago?
Yes.
Okay. Yep, you can definitely do that. And of course, you can assign input to a list or an array. You can do all those fun things. Are we good? Even though this is a long statement, it's a confusing statement. Are we good with what that's saying to us?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Everybody has their interpreter readily available. 2 exercises for us. First one, we're going to store the names of our 3 favorite superheroes in a list. Let's call that list heroes, just to keep everything simple. I want you to then, after you've stored the names in a list, print each hero's name by accessing each element one at a time. Break it up in small, easy parts. First thing is we need a name, a variable, heroes. We know we're going to be assigning some values to it, so we'll use that equal sign. And we now have the power of a list in our toolkit. And lists always begin and end with brackets. The only thing we now need to do is make sure that we can put our values in there. So values are separated with a comma, and if you're using a name, it's a string, so those are always wrapped in quotes. All right. Did everybody get their lists okay with little to no incident? We got to keep the train moving, so I'm going to help you out. We created a variable, heroes. We did our assignment operator. We indicated to the interpreter we're going to have a list, so it's going to begin with a bracket, and then we just list all of our items one at a time. Now, if we wanted to print our heroes out. We can use the same bracket notation. It's pretty consistent, so it makes it easier for us. If we want to print the first one, here's my output right here. All I need to do is change the indexes, and I get exactly what I was looking for. So we printed Ant-Man, printed a Wasp Gal, and we printed Ladybug, just by changing the index of the list. Right. I'm going to let you guys do exercise 2 on your own. If you have any problems pulling out this one, please let me know. But essentially, I want you to do the exact same thing, but I want you to do it with a personalization. I want you to use that code that we looked at before, which is an F string. But try to do it by thinking through it without just going straight to the answer. Okay? If you did have questions or it didn't quite work out for you, send me a message. We can walk through it together. That's pretty much it. We're going to be doing a lot of lists and a lot of playing with lists. So if you don't get it right away, that's okay. We're going to have some time. So let's talk about modifying lists. Modifying lists are pretty simple. The only thing we need to do is take a list, choose the index that we want to replace, and then assign it a new value. It's literally the exact same thing as when we reassign a value to a variable. And that's what makes Python so cool. I mean, if you know it at the most basic level, you can pretty much just scale it up and just protract the same process and make it work. So in this scenario, I had my weapons of choice: a Nintendo Blaster, nunchucks, and a salty attitude. That makes sense, that's about me, but I wanted something a little more badass. So instead of nunchucks, I said, I want to put a lightsaber in there. So I went through my list, I took index 1, which is the second element, that would be nunchucks, and I said, you know what, make that equal lightsaber. And then now, my weapons of choice are Nintendo Blaster, lightsaber, and I still got my saltitude. We have a couple of other ways to modify lists. Specifically when we're adding items to a list, there's 2 ways to do that. One is with the append method. It seems like it's really complicated, but methods are just those little tools, those little toolkits that we get to use that are already attached to the object that we're playing with. Well, the object that we're playing with just happens to be a list, right? Cool. So methods tend to be aptly named. When you append, you're adding something to the end. You're just continuing something on. So that's exactly what the append method does. The append method works with lists and other modifiable sets. So all you need to do if you want to add something on to our weapons of choice is you would dot, because the dot says I'm going to start using my tool. Append is the name of the tool, right? That's our method. And then it takes a single parameter or a single piece of input. That single input is whatever we want to add onto our list. In this scenario, I want to add ninja stars to my weapons of choice. Makes sense, right? So I'm going to take my weapons of choice, dot append, so I'm going to use that method, I'm going to use that tool, and then as a parameter, I'm going to give it whatever I want to add to the end. Fairly simplistic, right? The method meets kind of the criteria of the definition. So that's how we can add to our list. If we want to add to our list, but not necessarily add to the end, there is another method called insert. Insert's cool. It looks really confusing, but I promise you it's not. The only difference between append and insert, albeit besides the name, is that it takes 2 parameters. Seems confusing, but it's really not. The first parameter is an integer. It's the index where you want to create your new item. that's going in your list. And the second parameter is the same as the append. It's whatever you want to add to your list. It doesn't have to be a string, but in this scenario we're playing with strings. So my weapons of choice were my Nintendo Blaster, my lightsaber, and a Saltitude. Well, I wanted to insert grenades because, I mean, you're pretty badass when you have grenades. So therefore, I'm inserting insert method into index 1, which is the second space, grenades. And all it does is it takes a list and it stretches it out a little bit and throws it right in there. There's a lot of confusion for some folks when you start playing around with methods because it looks different. I get it. It's totally foreign. All of a sudden we're playing around with parentheses, and all of a sudden we've got these things called parameters. We've got extra things inside stuff. But take a step back, take a breath, realize a method, all it is a tool that whatever we're attaching it to can use. We know that we're playing around with a method if you see parentheses. That's just the easy way to know. If you see the parentheses, we're playing around with a method. It's a tool for whatever it's attached to. It's attached by this little period here. Okay, so that's pretty simple. And then depending on what the method is, it takes some parameters. Append is just adding something to the end. It only takes one parameter. It takes a string or an int or whatever it is you're trying to add. The insert takes two parameters, but that's not too scary. It's asking me where do I want to put it and what do I want to put. Cool with that, guys?
Yep.
Awesome. Guys, it is 8:20. I am so sorry. I did not mean to hold you over. If you cannot stay, or if you're like Harley and you're working 500 hours a week and you need to just crash out, I understand. I'm gonna keep pushing to finish the video, and then you'll see the video attached on the module. I will not take it personally if you wanna tap out right here. If you want to keep going, I'll be happy to have you. Just let me know if anything's confused or anything needs some additional explanation, okay?
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. Oh man, for those of you that are going the distance, it looks like a lot of crap on the screen. We're gonna go through it step by step. I promise it's not too bad. So the last page we're looking at are ways to add on to our list. Well, I want to show you a couple of ways to get rid of things on your list. And just like we had two ways to do it, we've got two ways to remove stuff. The first one is called delete, and it's a little funky because the short term for it is DEL, but delete is not a method. This is one of those weird edge cases, and the way delete works is super simple, so I can appreciate it and I hope you can too. If you want to get rid of something in your list and you know exactly where it sits in your list, all you need to do is type DEL, whatever the list is, obviously, and then whatever index number. So let's say I want to get rid of my Saltitude. I got really humble just now. That's cool. I'm going to delete element number 3 or index 2 from weapons of choice. So what I used to have was Nintendo Blaster, a lightsaber, and a Saltitude. Now it's just Nintendo Blaster and a lightsaber. Gone. DEL does exactly what you think it would. There is another form of getting rid of something from a list, and it is called the pop command or the pop method. Pop and delete do almost the exact same things. Difference is pop is a method because it's used by a bunch of different objects in Python, but pop allows you to use whatever you're popping off, where delete, it just gets rid of something and it's saying like, okay, you want to get rid of something in your list, cool, delete it. Pop is like, I want to get rid of something in my list, but I want to use it as I'm removing it. It sounds really confusing, but it goes back to this concept of stacks, which we don't really play around with too much in Python, but maybe we should, of adding something on. You were adding data into a container of some kind, and then as we pop it off the stack, as we take it out, then we're like looking at it and evaluating it. So in this admittedly scary looking statement here, I'm saying just like we did before in F-string, when aliens attack, the first thing I'll grab is my weapon of choice, and I'm going to hit the pop method. The pop is going to take whatever the last thing on my list is, and it's going to take it off my list. So before I used this command, I had a blaster, a saber, and a saltitude. Well, after this command, I'll just have my blaster and my saber, but I will have been able to use my saltitude in the output. So the real reason I want you to see this and put it side by side is delete just removes something. You're not using it. You're just saying, I don't need this data anymore. Pop means you're getting rid of it, but as you get rid of it, you're going to be using it in something. By default, if you just use pop with no parameter, it's just going to take the very last thing. It's going to take the last element. If you put a number in there, it will take whatever element number you're talking about. Do you guys kind of understand the difference between delete versus pop? If you're planning on using the data as you get rid of it, as you're having it exit your list, you're going to use pop. If you just want to get rid of it because you don't need it anymore, just delete that nonsense. There's one other remove, and this one is a little different. So delete and pop are great if you know the index, you know where it sits in your list. Sometimes when we code, we have no idea what the index number is, but we know what the value is. And that's when we would use the remove. So remove is a method, and it's unlike almost all the other methods that we saw before, where you have to know an index. This one assumes, rightfully so most of the time, we don't know where the hell it sits on my list. We just know we want to get rid of something, and we know what it's called. So here I've got my ton of weapons of choice: blasters, grenades, lightsabers, saltitude, and ninja stars. I don't know where grenades are on my belt, but I know I want to get rid of them. So weapons of choice dot remove, poof, grenades are gone, and it shifts everything down. Does that make sense why we're using a different method? One is for we just want to get rid of something within the list and we know the number. This is I don't know where it is in my list, I just know what it is I want to remove. It's a little confusing, but I hope you can see delete versus pop versus remove. If I were going to put this on a quiz, I probably wouldn't be so harsh as to have you tell me what it was, but I might do a matching. Like, hey, this is an example of remove, here's remove, where is it, something like that. God, I know we're exhausted, you guys are champs for sticking through. Let me talk about one other way of using remove, and then I want to show you something. I'm just going to touch on it and we'll go through it for the next week. Yeah, we'll save it for another time. I'm just going to give you one more example of remove. Another reason remove is super cool is because remove can be used with a variable. Let me explain it. Hang in, guys. 2 more minutes. Here we go. Let's say I have my weapons of choice, and I'm creating a list. My weapons of choice in my list: Nintendo Blaster, grenades, lightsaber, a salty attitude, and ninja stars. That sounds like a party to me. Okay, cool. I got my list, I'm ready. Let's just say I have a variable or even another list, and my variable in this scenario happens to be called 2explodey. It's things that blow up way too much. Those are not things that I want on my particular weapon of choice. That means that I can take weapons of choice and use the remove method And then instead of saying specifically grenades, I can say to explodey. And whatever's in this value right here, whatever value is attached to explodey, will be removed. And kind of like what Christian was talking about earlier, this is a great scenario where you can have input from the user. You don't even know, what's gonna. It's too dynamic. You can't plan ahead for what the user's wishes are. You might say, like, create a list of things. All right, I asked the user, what do you want to remove from the list? And then you assign to a variable, and that's what gets removed. These are the kind of cases and scenarios that we would use something like this in. And this is why it's a lot, I don't want to say it's more valuable than working off an index number, but I mean, you can see that there is certainly some value in not having to know where something sits in a collection and just knowing what it's called and being able to get rid of it. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yes.
Groovy. Okay. I'm sorry, you guys are so exhausted, and I appreciate you hanging in with me. So, oftentimes when you see the remove, this is how you'll see it in this format. That it somehow has been assigned, a variable has been assigned, and it's intended to be dynamic, and that's how they're using it, as opposed to going off an index. Because you're starting adding things to a list or modifying the list, you won't know where grenades sit or whatever the item is that you want, but you might know the value, and that's what you want to get rid of. So in this scenario, the result would be, the weapons of choice would be Blaster, Lightsaber, Solitude, and Ninja Stars. Grenades would have been removed because grenades was equal to explodey, and we got rid of that. By the same token, if we had a list of things that we didn't want, like let's say pointy things, and Ninja Stars and a Nintendo Blaster were on that pointy things list, all we'd have to do was say remove pointy things, and then we could get rid of a bunch of things from our list that fit that motif. I hope that makes sense, but if it doesn't, don't worry about it. We got plenty of time to play around with it. There's a lot of stuff that just got unloaded on you tonight. I don't want you to get too in your own head about it. We're going to take it baby steps. I want to give you the breadth, and then we'll play around with it in case-by-case scenarios. I'm going to save this. I'm going to make this kind of an interactive assignment, and I'll put a video with this. But there's a couple of other methods meant for organizing lists. Don't worry about that. I'll put another video together, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible, and I'll attach a little assignment to it. And then I will also give you a rundown of how to iterate through lists or go through lists automatically, dynamically, without having to type, print heroes element 0, element 1, element 2. I'll throw that up there before this weekend. If you have any other questions, if something goes off in your brain and you're like, oh wait, what about this? I don't think I got this. Send me a message, send me a text, send me an email. And we can go through it together. And if you have any questions about the quiz, let me know and we can talk it through.